Good morning, everybody. If everyone can find their seats, we will get started. First and foremost, welcome to the 40th Annual Transport Chicago Conference. My name is Lucy Chen, the president of this year's board, and I'm so honored to be kicking off the day. Over the past 40 years, this organization, thank you. Over the past 40 years, this organization has served our region as a vital forum for sharing knowledge and shaping the future of transportation. Whether you know us as the Metropolitan Conference on Public Transportation Research, or now as Transport Chicago, together we have navigated through the evolving landscape of transportation, celebrating our collective successes and learning from missed opportunities. Personally, this conference has solidified my passion for this industry as well as the beautiful city of Chicago, and I'm also so honored to be part of an organization that's committed to platforming and empowering a diverse group of voices of people to advocate for all communities, all people, especially as a woman, a person of color, as an immigrant. Those are so important to me, and I'm so thankful for this organization. Our program today reflects the remarkable achievements, valuable partnerships, and collective advancement of this industry over the years. On behalf of this year's steering committee, we hope you enjoy the day and continue to forge new relationships, inspire one another toward another 40 years of progress. And Transport Chicago is only able to be what it has become today through the continued commitment and support from everyone in this room. We typically honor our steering committee during our afternoon plenary, but I'd like to invite anyone who's ever been a part of Transport Chicago or MCPTR as a speaker, as a steering committee member, to please stand at this time so we can see just how strong this community is. Thank you all so much for being here today. And as a bit of an experiment, can anyone who was involved in year 2010 or earlier stand? What about those since year 2000? Before the year 2000? Amazing, thank you all for being here. And lastly, 1990. I love it. We have a few remaining. I'll call out Ian Savage, who will have a wonderful session this afternoon about the history of Transport Chicago. And if you haven't figured it out, this is actually a really smooth segue into introducing our morning keynote speaker, Luann Hamilton. In addition to her leadership in establishing this organization, Luann has worked for the Chicago Department of Transportation and its predecessor, the Department of Public Works, for 34 years, starting as a city planner in 1985 and serving as deputy commissioner of the Division of Project Development for 14 years. As division head, she led a staff dedicated to multi-modalism during the growth of Chicago's pedestrian and bicycle programs and the launch of Vision Zero. Since her retirement from CDOT, Luann has served as senior advisor at TranSmart, now Atlas, and currently serves as president of the board of the Active Transportation Alliance. Please join me in welcoming Luann.
Thank you. Before I begin, I wanted to thank the Chicago Department of Transportation for their support in putting my presentation together. Thanks especially to Tom Carney, the commissioner of CDOT, as well as Erica Schroeder, the director of public information. They provided a lot of the graphics you're going to see in my talk. I'm going to be talking about the changing world of Chicago transportation, 1985 to 2025. And there are two major themes that will run through my talk. One is the changing focus from traditional modes to active transportation. At the start of my career, I was in the Department of Public Works, Bureau of Transportation Planning and Programming, and we were divided into two sides, a highway side and a transit side. And I was on the transit side, and we mostly focused on rapid transit, light rail, which we were still thinking about doing in Chicago then, as well as some major bus operations, such as the State Street Mall. The other side of the bureau was the highway side, and they were primarily focused on designing streets for the efficient movement of auto traffic. Later in my career, our focus shifted to complete streets, giving full consideration to transit, biking, and walking in all street design. The other big thing that runs through my talk is the changing structures and agencies that we deal with. Part of it is legislative. We had a couple major federal bills that passed relatively early in my career that really impacted transportation going forward. And then there were also changes in agencies. So the regional agencies changed, the city's agencies changed. So that will also be a thread going through my talk. And I'll be closing with my favorite project, my least favorites, and a closing thought. And you can guess which one will be the least favorite. No. I served under 4 Chicago mayors, pictured here. I was hired in 1985 when Harold Washington was the mayor. He was the first black mayor who had been elected in 1983. Yeah. And I was really very excited to get hired by the city. I considered it to be a very progressive organization. I really wanted to work for Harold Washington. And I was pretty much heartbroken when he passed away suddenly in 1987, just after he had won a second term. For a while, I thought about leaving the city and doing something else. But my work and my work friends were constants that eventually led me to serve under 4 mayors. I worked under many more commissioners than mayors, 14. Too many to talk about here. I wanted to set the stage by talking about a couple things that were happening before I was hired that affected the transportation system or what we did in the coming years. One was the reorganization of the RTA in 1983. At that time, the RTA did not have the service boards it has now. It was basically the CTA doing its thing, and then the RTA staff having to do all these purchase of service agreements with commuter rail operators and bus operators to provide service in the suburban area. And there was a financial crisis, just like today. And there have been a number of these financial crises over the years, but this one was pretty extreme. And it went to the state legislature, and in exchange for a new state contribution towards transit operating expenses, this new structure was created with the 3 service boards under the RTA. And CTA, Metro, and PACE were required by state law to meet a combined 50% system-wide operating cost recovery ratio through their fare box, which is very unusual. And of course, the bulk of this came from the CTA because it had many, many more riders and much more operating revenue. The high fare box recovery requirement in Illinois is unique to us. Most transit systems don't have a fare box recovery ratio, and if they do, it's much lower than our 50%. So this is one of the issues that needs to be addressed in legislation. The other major thing that happened right before I was hired was the demise of the Crosstown Expressway. So if you look at the map on the left, this shows the expressway system as conceived in 1943 by the city of Chicago. And of all those expressways, only the Crosstown didn't get built. It's the dashed line. It basically would have connected all of the radial lines coming out of the city, all the way from the Kennedy, Edens on the north, around towards Midway and over to the Dan Ryan. It would have basically used the Cicero Avenue corridor as well as freight rail rights of way to traverse this area. And there was growing opposition to the expressway projects during the 1960s and 70s. And this is because communities got basically destroyed. You know, they were either completely eliminated or they were isolated by expressway construction in Chicago and elsewhere. And the neighborhoods on the southwest side were very concerned. If you look at that image on the right, you can see the rendering of what the expressway would have looked like. And so Midway is on your left. The southbound lanes would have been up against Cicero, and the northbound lanes would have been a half a mile to the east. So we have a half-mile swath that was supposedly going to stay a vital area and be redeveloped even. And I think the residents were like, this doesn't make any sense at all. We don't want this going through our communities, killing our area. So they fought back. They worked with Saul Alinsky, a community organizer, and all their institutions, like their churches. And in the end, the project was canceled by the Republican governor at the time, Jim Thompson, and the Democratic mayor. That was Jane Byrne in 1979. And when it was canceled, the funding had already been set aside for its construction. So there was about $2 billion in interstate transfer funds, shorthand IX funds, and that money was split between the city and the state. So the state got $1 billion and the city. The state used its $1 billion to do intersection improvements in the suburban area, otherwise known as throat widenings, to provide like separate lanes for left turns, right turns, and provide more capacity in intersections to further spur use of the automobile. And the city decided to use its $1 billion for transit or transit supportive projects. So I'll be going into them in more detail. That's what I was working on, being on the transit side. Some of the interstate transfer funded projects that we were doing in the 1980s and getting into the 90s included the ones shown here. On the left is the Blue Line extension out to O'Hare Airport. The Blue Line had ended at Logan Square, and it was being gradually extended westward by Public Works, the Department of Public Works. And when we got the IX funds, we were able to get all the way into O'Hare, into the terminal itself. The other project we did was the Orange Line. You could see that in the map in the center. And the Orange Line used the Loop L in the downtown and went all the way out to Midway Airport. So now Chicago would have both of its airports served by rapid transit, which was very unusual. One of the good things about that project was it freed up the State Street Transit Mall, which probably none of you remember, but the State Street Transit Mall was basically used by Archer Avenue buses, which served the southwest corridor in the city. And once the Orange Line opened, we didn't need the State Street Transit Mall anymore, and we could reopen State Street for other uses. And I have a photo here of Quincy on the elevated, the Loop L. The story of that is the plan was to demolish the Loop L and replace it with a subway. But the subway project got canceled, and the decision was made to do a rehab of the Loop L that would be under the Department of Public Works in terms of stations. And we were required, because it was designated as historic, to do one historic station. So that historic station is Quincy Wells. And the rest of the stations could be demolished, replaced, consolidated, which has been happening over the decades since. But if you ever wondered why Quincy Wells looks so quaint compared to the rest of the stations, that is the explanation. Another project that we did with IX funds, which you may not even be aware of, was the connection of the Howard and Dan Ryan lines. When the Dan Ryan line opened, it was paired for some unknown reason with the Green Line elevated, and what's now the Green Line elevated, the Lake Street line. And this was a very bad pairing. There was a big imbalance in terms of the use levels. So the Dan Ryan line, once it opened, was very popular and was very heavily used. The Lake Line, not so much. And this caused operating problems for CTA in terms of train sets and capacity and scheduling. And it was decided that CDOT would build a new tunnel that would connect the Dan Ryan and the Howard together, because they were more similar in terms of their ridership. So a subway was built from the Dan Ryan into the State Street subway at 13th Street, and it was changed over to this new configuration in 1993, and at the same time, CTA decided to recode their whole system to the colors we know today. So that was 1993. I was hired to work on IX-funded projects, develop grant applications for other federal funding, and help senior planners with their technical studies and projects. And one of the projects was the downtown pedway system. The pedway system had started when the Blue Line subway was built, the Dearborn subway. It was not finished until the early 1950s, even though the two subway projects started in the Depression in the 1930s. When it was built, there were connections made to the lower levels of buildings that were adjacent to the Blue Line subway. And eventually this caught on as a great idea for the developers in Chicago to be able to say, we have this direct connection from the subway into our building. And the pedway spread. And it was always kind of an organic growth. It wasn't very controlled, and it went off in different directions. The project underway when I arrived was the Randolph Street pedestrian way, and this was going to be a spine in the system that followed the south sidewalk of Randolph, basically, and it would connect the City Hall, the Daily Center, the two subway lines, as well as the Metro Electric in the South Shore. And the reason we had a pedway was that it was to address the comfort and safety of transit users during inclement weather and provide better first mile, last mile commuter access downtown. The system continued to expand through the 1990s, but it fell out of fashion with the shift to enlivening streets to make cities more walkable and livable. And I know there's going to be a session talking about the pedway today, so I'm probably going to stick around for it because I want to hear what's happening now. Another project that I worked on, talk about deja vu, was the Red Line extension. This was a study that was finished in 1989, and it was brought about because of the fact that the 95th Street Dan Ryan Station was extremely overcrowded and wasn't operating well, and we were asked to do this analysis to see what could be done to solve the problems there. So we looked at an extension, a full extension down to 130th, and at the time we looked at the corridor that follows the Bishop Ford Expressway by Lake Calumet, and it didn't perform well. Surprise, surprise, there's nobody there. But we then looked instead at one-station extensions. So if you look at the map on the left, those were the one-station extensions we considered. We also looked at expanding 95th Street Station to improve the capacity, and also to rebuild the bus terminal area, which was one of the major deficits. And then we also looked at a Metro Electric enhancement that would have included fare integration with the CTA to try and shift some of the ridership over to the Metro line so it didn't overburden the Red Line. And I don't think I mentioned, I should have, that the Dan Ryan Station at 95th had 27,000 daily riders when I started with the city. So that's why we did this study, which was a larger ridership than any downtown stations had. So it was extremely crowded, and it was also serving a huge catchment area. You know, the city went all the way to 138th Street, but the station was at 95th Street, so there were a lot of bus lines bringing people to the Red Line to feed them into the rail system. And it really, I guess when they first built it, they being probably Public Works, they didn't realize that it was going to be so crowded, so they underbuilt their bus terminal facility. So the recommendation of this study was to expand the station and to also do the Metro improvements. The station eventually did get expanded by the CTA much later, and now, of course, they are pursuing a Red Line extension, and wisely, they're looking further to the west for their corridor in an area that's got more population and employment. One of my fun projects early in my career was, I'm calling it 8888 here. If any Cub fans are in the room, they probably know what that means. This was the start of night baseball at Wrigley Field. And right around when I was hired, the Cubs had gone to the city of Chicago and said, we're moving, we're leaving Chicago unless we have night baseball. We're not competitive with the other teams because they all get to play at night and we don't. So the city decided we should move forward to negotiate the issue. And the city formed a large committee, very large, that met, it seemed like weekly for a while. And it included all of the agencies, all the electeds, as well as a lot of community representatives, including Citizens United for Baseball and Sunshine. I'm not making that up. And my role was to serve as a staffer, and I was primarily looking at parking. The parking included finding places near Wrigley Field that could be used by the Cubs for season ticket holder parking and for other premium parking, looking at an intermediate location between the Kennedy Expressway and the park where we could put a shuttle parking lot, a park and ride, and CTA would then provide a shuttle route that would operate over to the field and you wouldn't have to have everybody driving. And then the third thing was to develop a very large night baseball permit parking zone for the neighborhoods around the park. And this was subject of a lot of the negotiations toward the end, making sure it was big enough to cover everybody who was angry or concerned. So we managed to do it, and the night baseball went through, and 8/8/88 was the first night baseball game. As you can see in the lower right, the game was rained out. And at the time, I was on a rooftop nearby. One of my colleagues has a 3-flat near Wrigley, and we were having our party for the staff to celebrate. So there we were getting soaked. And so the game was canceled, and our party spirits were dampened. I'm going to turn to legislation now. I served on the region's Mobility Limited Advisory Committee in the late 1980s, and then all transit service for people with disabilities was separate paratransit operated by the service boards. And the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 changed all of that because it required equal transportation service for people with disabilities, shifting many from paratransit to mainline bus and rail service over time. The committee I was on ended up helping to develop the federally required ADA Key Station Plan, which looked at which stations should be prioritized for accessibility based on heavy use, key destinations, and transfer points. And at that time, the requirement was, where do we start with accessibility, especially of stations that had vertical elevations? Now, since then, CTA has adopted ASAP, the All Stations Accessibility Program, which is committed to providing vertical accessibility at all stations by 2038. The other landmark legislation that happened during my career was the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act of 1991. Why was ICE-T so impactful? When ICE-T passed, it upended the strict separation of highway and transit funding, allowing funds to be flexed from the highway side to transit. It linked federal transportation funding with regional air quality goals through the new CMAQ program, which would be administered at the regional level, not the state level, which previously controlled all federal highway funds. So this was a change that the region actually had a big say in what got funded. It wasn't all coming through Springfield. It provided funding for projects that improved air quality through cleaner vehicle technology, congestion mitigation, and diversions from auto to transit, cycling, and walking. ICE-T also included additional funding for bicycle and pedestrian projects through the Transportation Enhancement Program, which was a statewide program administered by IDOT, not CATS, and so there was less local input in that project selection process. In 1992, Chicago reorganized its infrastructure departments, ending the Department of Public Works after over 100 years. The city adopted a separate transportation agency to provide a more organizational focus on multimodal transportation instead of having these separate sides. and to take advantage of new funding opportunities for cities like the CMAQ program. And while getting ready for this talk, I found some document that said cities could apply for CMAQ funds, but only if they had a Department of Transportation. So that explains why we suddenly reorganized. No one ever really explained it to the staff. One of the most important roles in my career was my appointment to the CAT's CMAQ Project Selection Committee, where I served from 1992 to 2019, or 27 years. The committee helped to develop the evaluation tools for various types of eligible projects and programmed projects in coordination with the CAT staff and with our agency's priorities. I managed the internal process to evaluate and program candidate projects to be sponsored by CDOT. In addition to identifying eligible projects in other divisions, including the divisions of engineering, bridges and transit, and traffic, I advocated internally for projects we would sponsor. The best example is the Center for Neighborhood Technology. At the time, the Center for Neighborhood Technology wanted to start car sharing in Chicago, but they were told you cannot apply because you're not a government agency. So they approached us and asked if we could consider that. And I worked with the commissioner's office and eventually the mayor's office to get the approval to be the sponsor for that project. But that was great that we got to do that in partnership with CNT. And of course, IGO was a great success. The other things we did with the CMAQ funds over the years included ADA compliance stations like Grand State and Chicago State, and partial CMAQ funding for stations like the new Morgan Green-Pink line station that's shown on the left that became a catalyst for the Fulton Market redevelopment. And the city's 1992 bike parking project was the first federally funded bike parking project in the US under the CMAQ program. Of course, we went back every year after that for many years to get more bike racks. It was a high-scoring project, and it wasn't that expensive, and Chicago now has 17,000 bike parking spaces. The biggest change in the transportation landscape in Chicago due to CMAQ was the development of on-street and off-street bike facilities. We started securing funds for on-street striped bike lanes in the 1990s, and there's a photo on the right that shows what these typically looked like. There was no barrier separation of bikes from other traffic, just a painted stripe. So there wasn't even a stripe buffer to protect from either dooring or from side swipes from moving traffic. We focused on specific corridors where installation was the easiest, not on building a network. And implementation was very challenging due to local opposition, primarily from alders and business owners. And you've probably, at some point, if you've been here a while, experienced a bike lane on an arterial that just stops at an intersection and doesn't continue. And at that time, it was because the other aldermen didn't want it. There were numerous trail projects that were fully or partially funded through CMAQ over the years, including the Major Taylor Trail, the Valley Line Sauganash Trail, the Navy Pier Flyover, shown here at the left, and the 606. Now to do a little more history, I served on the CAT's Regional Transportation Plan Committee for the 2020 and 2030 plans, and on the CMAP Transportation Committee for the 2040 and 2050 plans, so 4 regional plans and 3 midterm updates. And as many of you probably know, regions are required to have a metropolitan planning organization and adopt a fiscally constrained regional transportation plan to receive federal transportation funds. In my early years on the plan committee, our biggest controversy involved whether we needed to include a South Suburban Airport in the 2020 plan. And I don't know, some of you weren't alive probably, but the city had sought to have a 3rd airport at Lake Calumet. And the idea wasn't a good one, and it failed. And at that time, the state came forward and said, well, we want to have a South Suburban Airport. And they eventually settled on Peatone, which is 50 miles south of downtown Chicago. However, the city was very opposed to this because they feared they would lose their passenger fees that they collected at O'Hare and Midway, and they used to build up O'Hare and Midway, and they didn't want those being siphoned off by the state to go to a South Suburban airport. So because of this deadlock, the planners had to figure out how could we do a regional plan that had two different airport options. And we worked with NIPSI at the time, the Northeastern Illinois Planning Commission, to have two separate population and employment forecasts for the region, so that whatever happened, we would still be eligible to receive our federal funds because we would have a plan that reflected what was going on the ground. And I learned that planners could figure out how to get around political infighting and still adopt a regional plan to keep federal funds flowing, which was always our bottom line charge, keep those federal funds flowing. CATS was founded in 1955, the Chicago Area Transportation Study, the brochure on the left, to study transportation in the Chicago region. And in 1962, the Federal Aid Highway Act required a new transportation planning process that was continuing, comprehensive, and cooperative. It was known as a 3C process in regions of 50,000 or more. CATS became the region's Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO, at that time, and NIPSI, which was founded in 1957, became the agency that was charged with developing the population employment forecast for the plan. In the early 2000s, concerns about unchecked sprawl, resulting congestion, and core disinvestment sparked the need to combine transportation and land use in a single agency. And this was driven by the Metropolis 2020, which was basically sponsored by the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club. And they were very concerned about our region, and they were very aggressive in getting the transportation leaders to take it seriously and develop the organization we know today, CMAP. When CATS and NIPSI merged in 2005, it was, if you ever look at the org chart, it's interesting that federal and transportation investment remained with the CATS MPO. So even though it's part of the CMAP org chart, it's its own separate entity, and it did not report to the MPO, to the CMAP board. And the reason for this is because there was an onerous federal requirement that required the agreement between a governor and the units of local government that represented 75% of metro area population, including the central city, to designate a new MPO. And I think that the decision was, why should we go through all that hell? It'll probably take us years, and we won't be getting any federal funds. So the decision was, we want a regional unified agency, but let's carve out that MPO function so we can just keep getting our money. I consulted with the mayor's office at the time, and in particular the director of regional programs, Rita Athas, on the city's position and how to structure CMAP. CDOT started working on freight issues in the mid-1990s, and we eventually collaborated with the mayor's office as well as the city's Washington, D.C. office on this. And what brought us to the table was the increased intermodal container traffic from Asia to U.S. markets passing through Chicago, truck traffic congestion around intermodal yards that resulted from all that traffic, quality of life issues in communities, and concern about railroad mergers consolidating railroad power. So the railroads have a lot of power under the Interstate Commerce Act, and the fear was that if we kept letting them merge, there would only be a couple left, and we would really be screwed. You know, cities and states would have nothing, no way, no recourse, and the railroads could do whatever they wanted. So to avoid that, in 2000, a letter was sent to Linda Morgan at the Surface Transportation Board, that's the regulatory agency for the railroads, from Mayor Richard M. Daley, asking for federal intervention to bring railroads to the table to negotiate improvements in Chicago. The discussions broadened over the next couple of years after that, and eventually included the state, the 6 freight and 2 passenger railroads, the Association of American Railroads representing them all, and later in 2018, Cook County also joined the stakeholders. The original stakeholder agreement to pursue the CREATE program was signed in 2003 by the CDOT Commissioner, the IDOT Secretary, and AAR's Executive Director. I represented CDOT on the Management Committee, which was below the stakeholders, and we were the ones that worked together to create the program. And the price tag at that time, when it was announced in 2003, was $1.534 billion. Although $1.6 billion has been secured to date, the price tag is risen to $4.6 billion. But the railroads are and the communities are still working on 75th Street corridor improvements, and this is the linchpin of CREATE to relieve congestion and improve both commuter rail and freight in Chicago. There were previous efforts to improve rail transport in the downtown Chicago area. These included the subway I mentioned earlier, which was called the Franklin Street Subway, but that got killed in 1979. And then there was something called the Central Area Circulator, which was a light rail system that got killed in 1996 by Richard M. Daley because the funding had collapsed, the funding deal had collapsed, and he's like, okay, then we're not gonna do it. So in the early 2000s, the city decided we needed to take a fresh look at the downtown, including its transportation. And the first plan to come out was the 2003 Central Area Plan. There was a 2009 update. The Department of Planning led this effort, but the Chicago Department of Transportation was by their side while they did it. And everybody wanted a big idea for transportation, and we came up with the image on the right, which is it's the West Loop Transportation Center. I don't know how many of you have seen it before, but it was going to be a 4-level tunnel under Clinton Street that would serve the commuter rail stations and better connect them. It also had other functions, inner-city function. So the lowest level was high-speed rail, and that was going to be controlled by Amtrak. The level above that was CTA Rapid Transit, another link in the CTA system. Above that was the BRT level, and then just under the sidewalk was the pedestrian way. And although the project hasn't progressed, CDOT protected corridor for this. And most people don't know this, but over the years, my group was responsible for protecting right-of-way for projects, many of which haven't happened yet, like the Orange Line extension to Ford City. We bought land out there, we've got it. But in this case, we had to negotiate with Fifield, I think it was, for the Kinsey Station development, and also with the Jewel that's located at Des Plaines and Kinsey, because the high-speed rail alignment would go under their properties. And in the case of Jewel, they actually agreed to raise their parking onto a deck so that the trains could emerge from their tunnel there to connect with the surface lines going out of the city. So it's a cool project, but I'm not holding my breath. Some of the things that were in the central area plans that we did do included intermodal bus transfer centers. We did the Congress Metro Rock Island Station Center in 2011, and a much more substantial Union Station transfer center at Jackson and Canal with a below-grade connection to the train station in 2016. I worked on the property acquisition for the Union Station Center, which required condemnation of properties owned by a local construction company, which will remain nameless, and the Board of Education, believe it or not. And one of my most interesting days was spent in an arbitrator's office. We had gone to court, and the judge ordered arbitration on the costs for these properties, and we were locked in separate rooms for like 12 hours on a Friday. Very strategic decision by the arbitrator, so that by the end of the day, people had appointments or family obligations, and it's like, okay, we agree to these prices, and that was it. It only took a day, so I recommend it. We also worked to build new L stations. So on the right is the Cermak station on the Green Line, which opened in 2015 to serve the McCormick Place expansion. And also, we worked on the Loop L station consolidations with the project at Washington Wabash opening in 2017. CDOT reorganized in late 2004, and the Division of Project Development, or DPD, was established with me as the Deputy Commissioner. DPD was responsible for incubating new projects focused on active transportation, sustainable urban design, safe streets, bicycle and pedestrian projects, and programs. A new multimodal transportation review process was developed. So before that, if a developer came in with a PD, they had their consultant group do their traffic study, usually KLOA, and it would go into traffic, and they would always approve it. And it was basically focused on auto movements, so signal upgrades and improvements that could be done to make it easier for people to drive in and out of the development. We set up a whole multimodal task force of staff who would review these plans, not just from a traffic perspective, but for overall accessibility by all modes. And this was a great improvement in the process. Soon after the reorganization of CDOT in 2005, Chicago was named one of 5 pedestrian safety action areas in the US. So the other 4 were states. So we were the only city that qualified, which is a sad statement. And that was due to our high pedestrian crash rates and deaths. From 2001 to 2005, Chicago had averaged more than 3,700 pedestrian motor vehicle crashes per year, with 71 killed and 930 seriously injured each year. US DOT provided Chicago with technical support for developing and implementing a safety plan, launching CDOT's pedestrian safety program. This included an analysis of that data set of that 5-year period, showing things like the predominant times of day and days of week for crashes, the most dangerous intersections, the most dangerous school zones, ward-by-ward comparisons, ages of victims, and much more. And the data was used to determine priority locations for our new countermeasures, which included refuge islands, bump outs, raised crosswalks, and where to install pedestrian countdown signals first. So at one point, they weren't required, but MUTCD had now required pedestrian countdowns, and we needed to decide where should they go. So we used all of that data to help develop a model to rank all of the signal locations that weren't already being done as part of projects. And that was our roadmap then to installing pedestrian countdowns. Another major event that affected transportation in Chicago was the 2007 pedestrian ramp case settlement. The city was sued in 2005 for failing to install ADA-compliant pedestrian ramps at intersections. The lawsuit was settled in 2007 through a court decree requiring Chicago to meet ADA curb ramp requirements going forward. This included spending $10 million a year for 5 years on new ramps in high-traffic areas not programmed for repair or replacement, continuing to spend $18 million a year for new ramps at resurfaced intersections and adjacent alleys, and requiring other agencies, including utilities, to install compliant ramps at intersections that were impacted by their projects. A committee consisting of agency reps, plaintiffs, other disability rights activists was established to select the high traffic locations for the $50 million investment, and engineering's deputy, Dan Burke, and I were on that committee representing CDOT. And I would say that Chicago is much more accessible now than it was in 1987 or in 2007, thanks to the lawsuit. And I think it's important for agencies to invest when there are changes in MUTCD or other requirements like the ADA guidelines for the public way, and not to put it off, because when you put it off, you get sued, and then the courts will determine what you have to do next. So I know there's a recent court decision that is requiring the city to invest in accessible pedestrian signals, which are the audible signals, and it's setting out their timeline that they have to do to implement this because they didn't move fast enough. When I left in 2019, we were still trying to get it going. So, you know, you can't do that when there are these laws out there and there are people ready to sue. You know, you have to get it done because that's what's best for society. Mayor Rahm Emanuel was sworn in May 16th, 2011, and appointed Gabe Klein, the former commissioner of DDOT in Washington, D.C., to implement active transportation in Chicago. He had made campaign promises, and he wanted them implemented yesterday. This was a pivotal moment for CDOT and my division because of the fast pace of our active transportation improvements. The first protected bike lane on Kinsey, east of Milwaukee, opened in June of 2011. So that's a little over a month after Ron became the mayor. The Dearborn bike lanes, which were much more substantial, from Polk to Kinsey with concrete separation and bike signals, were installed in December of 2012. Protected bike lanes on Milwaukee, from Kinsey to Elston, and of course, Milwaukee is the superhighway, or if you want to call it that, or the main street for bicycling in Chicago. It carries the most bike traffic. Those were installed in June of 2013, and of course this then provided a link into downtown combined with the Kinsey bike lanes. And this speed was possible because the city provided local funds which could be used quickly, whereas we previously were dependent on federal funds for bike lane projects. And that took much longer for projects to be implemented, and it required IDOT approval, which always slowed things down. While we were doing all of this, we also completed the Streets for Cycling Plan 2020 and the Chicago Pedestrian Plan in 2012. And Divvy, our bike share system, was launched with 750 bikes and 75 stations in June of 2013. So it was definitely a lot of energy during this period. Vision Zero was another priority during these years. We started working on Vision Zero under Gabe Klein and continued under Rebecca Scheinfeld. And this was a safe systems approach to pedestrian and traffic safety that was pioneered in Sweden. Safe systems recognize that all street users, no matter if driving, walking, or biking, will inevitably make mistakes. The system needs to be designed and managed to keep the risks of mistakes less severe. The goal is to protect us all, but especially the most vulnerable, people walking or biking, and children, seniors, and people with disabilities. The Vision Zero initiative was announced in September of 2016. The Vision Zero Action Plan was released in June of 2017, that's shown on the left. And the goal was 0 deaths and serious injuries by 2026. The action plan provided a detailed roadmap to reach the goal of 0, including identifying 43 high crash corridors and 8 high crash areas that would be the initial focus of program outreach and capital improvements. In 2019, the first Vision Zero high crash area action plan was released for the West Side, Austin, Garfield Park, and North Lawndale. And we spent many evenings at meetings working with the community there to get a plan that they supported. And I think we were doing some innovative public engagement techniques like providing food and holding the meeting when people could get back from work and come in and have dinner, maybe have their kids there too, while they interacted on these design issues. So I thought that those plans were great. Unfortunately, I didn't get to stay for too many more because I retired, but I hope they all went forward. In the transit arena, we had the Loop Link, which addressed the poor connectivity between commuter rail stations in the West Loop and the Central Loop. It was funded through a 2010 federal urban circulator grant that we got under Mayor Richard M. Daley. So even though Ram took credit for it, the funding actually came from his predecessor. The transit alignment followed the Washington and Madison one-way pair, and the project also included east-west protected bike lanes and pedestrian safety upgrades. Commissioner Scheinfeld worked through a challenging public participation process to get the Loop Link across the finish line in December of 2015. And you can only imagine all these affluent downtown businessmen who were very upset that they might have a longer commute to get to their parking space. And so we had a lot of pretty tense conversations, but we got through it. And one of the people, and I won't name him, actually came up to us on the street one day and said, "You were right, it does work." That was gratifying. So the Loop Link supported Mayor Emanuel's goal to develop BRT in Chicago. along with a more ambitious crosstown corridor that was proposed to run along either Ashland or Western. A CTA alternatives analysis determined at the time that the best option was center-running north-south BRT, extending 16 miles on Ashland from 95th Street to Irving Park Road. The project was dropped in 2015 due to opposition to elimination of most left turns. We only had 3 left turns in the 16 miles, which was maybe a little too extreme a starting position. There were concerns about truck access to the Kinsey Industrial Corridor, concerns from other auto-oriented businesses in the corridor, and these retailers were afraid that consumers wouldn't be willing to drive around the block to get into their parking lots. So they were whispering in the mayor's ear, I think. And then the Emanuel re-election campaign had concerns about growing political opposition to the project. So as a result, the project was dropped. But there's still community interest in north-south BRT connecting neighborhoods, and this includes support from the Active Transportation Alliance. Getting to the end of my talk, I wanted to talk about a couple projects that happened late in my career. That was the 606 Bloomingdale Trail and the bridges over Lakeshore Drive in the Burnham Park area. The 606 opened in June of 2015, but it was recommended in CDOT's Bike Facilities Development Plan in the late 1990s and in the Planning Department's Logan Square Open Space Plan in 2004. So there was a lot of work that happened before it actually got implemented. I first became involved in considering this corridor for other uses in 1985. Yes, this was one of my first things I worked on. The Freight Railroad at the time wanted to give it to the city for a truck route because they probably thought, well, there's still industry, but they can get their goods on trucks and they can have our right-of-way, but we don't want to serve it anymore. And so I did research on it, and we wrote the letter saying, thanks, but no thanks. When there isn't any more business that depends on rail in the Clybourne corridor or along the Chicago River, then we'll talk. And so that's what happened. They came back a long time later when we were really ready to work with them on it. The other projects were bicycle pedestrian bridges over South Lakeshore Drive. CDOT completed the 35th Street Bike Ped Bridge in November of 2016 and the 41st Street Bridge in December of 2018, and since then has completed the 43rd Street Bridge. These projects were recommended in CDOT's South Lakefront Access Study from the early 2000s, and there's a lakefront plan from the maybe 1960s that calls for quarter-mile access to the lakefront along the full length of Lakeshore Drive, and the most egregious example where this wasn't happening was this South Lakefront area. Even though we had done underpasses as part of rebuilding South Lakeshore Drive in the mid-2000s, in our 2004 timeframe, this area to the north there didn't get any access because you would have to cross rail, not just cross a road. So you'd have to span the metro tracks and the freight trains that ran there as well. So they became separate projects because they were more expensive and elaborate. I'm really happy that now we have these bridges in place, because these communities were cut off for decades by the rail lines from getting to the lakefront. My favorite project is the Major Taylor Trail. I started working on it in 1991, and even though it had its ribbon cutting in 2007, I kept working on it right up to 2019 because there were always issues with it. I started working on it in 1991 when the railroad, the Conrail Railroad came into the city and said, we've got this line, the Panhandle, and we don't need it anymore, and we can sell it to you. They weren't offering it for free, they wanted to sell it. And it ran from 75th Street to the Little Calumet River in Riverdale. Conrail didn't mention at this meeting in the mayor's office that there were many encroachments on the right-of-way, including a church, or that they sold key parcels to others for development, including the whole stretch between 96th and 103rd, which was sold for the Beverly Point housing development. CDOT secured funding for the trail in the early 90s, but we spent years acquiring the necessary property. And actually, the church is probably still there, so there's a lot of encroachments that remained. My team was involved in the public process from the beginning to the end, and this included several community meetings with angry residents worried about crime. We initially had trouble getting support from the 5 alders in the corridor. In 1996, I learned about Marshall Major Taylor, an African-American athlete who held the world record for speed cycling in the late 1890s and was called the world's fastest man, when watching a feature on him during the 1996 Summer Olympics. We decided to call the project the Major Taylor Trail to attract interest and gain more support. In addition to reaching out to the producer of that segment that was shown during the Olympics to see if we could talk to the Taylor family and have them participate in a ribbon cutting, which of course didn't happen because it took us another 10 plus years to actually have a ribbon cutting. Keith Privet of my staff purchased copies of Major Taylor's biography as gifts for the alders. And that was a really good move because Carrie Austin, who headed the City Council Budget Committee at the time, loved Taylor's story and became a champion of the Major Taylor Trail. I don't think it would have happened without her support. What I like most about this project is that the community rallied around the trail once it was built, starting the Major Taylor Cycling Club, the Major Taylor Trail Keepers, and advocating for further improvements, including lighting and art. I consider this my most successful project because of its strong community support. And then my least favorites. What can I say about these 2 boondoggles? The parking meter deal came about when the city was trying to secure a 2008 federal transportation grant that required privatization and variable pricing in proposals. I knew the mayor's office was looking at meter pricing increases. I didn't know that they had decided that the only way to make it happen quickly, not just for this grant, but also to plug a large budget shortfall that year, was to sell 36,000 parking spaces to investors for 75 years. The deal has made it more challenging and costly to implement complete streets projects on arterials, including protected bike lanes and bus lanes. As of 2023, the investors, CPM LLC, had recouped their investment plus $500 million profit and still had 60 years left on the deal. And then finally, one of the last things I worked on in my 34-year career at the city was express transit to O'Hare a la Elon. The highlight was a visit to SpaceX headquarters, and Kevin, that was fun, near LAX to see the prototype of the tunnel we would soon have in Chicago. While SpaceX itself was very cool, with rockets under construction and a control room that rivaled NASA's, the less said about the unimpressive tunnel, the better. Finally, I have a closing thought. Over 34 years, I attended many community meetings where folks were concerned about proposed changes to streets in their neighborhood. Some were angry, some were simply afraid. We often had to hold multiple meetings on a single project, even a single intersection, to get neighbors, businesses, and electeds on board. We were successful more often than not, but I learned that many people are afraid of change, no matter what the scale or the benefits. We have to keep talking and listening so people can understand that change is often necessary to gain greater community benefits, and I wish young planners the best in continuing this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Luann. If you all don't mind cutting into our passing period a little bit, we will take a few minutes for some quick questions. We have some folks circulating the room with microphones, so give us a quick wave if you have a question you'd like to ask. Oh, we got one in the back.
This is John Paul Jones from the Inglewood District. I want to thank you for your commitment to public service. You've been a blessing to our community for many, many years, and I was just so happy that they chose you to be the keynote speaker. You've been a real blessing to Chicago.
Thank you very much.
Yes, indeed. The question on the trails. Matter of fact, the question on the parking meters. Huge problem. What's the solution?
Well, I know there have been lawsuits, but they haven't gone anywhere. I think that it's a cash solution. I think the city would have to come up with the money to pay them back. And so I don't know when that's going to happen, given the city's budget is never that flush. But I don't know what else they can do. I mean, it's very unfortunate. It was very, how do we say? It was a bad decision, very bad decision. I wish they had talked to us more about it before they made the deal. I mean, somebody came over from the revenue office to see us in December, and this all had to be done by the end of December. And I was asking questions like, well, what do we do if we need to improve a corner clearance and we need to remove a parking space? Can we do that? And they were, oh, sure. You can just move it somewhere else. Most of the streets in Chicago don't have paid parking, so there's plenty of places we could shift it to. But they didn't read the city code closely enough to realize that aldermen are actually the ones controlling this, not CDOT. So that, if an alderman says, I don't want to move that space, and you can't just put it in another alderman's ward. You have to maybe have them make a deal. So you get into let's make a deal between aldermen about moving spaces when required. So it just was, they didn't have enough information to make this decision. They were making it too quickly.
Hi, Luann. Kyle Whitehead with the RTA.
Kaya?
It seems like so much of our transportation challenges come down to arterial streets in both the city and the suburbs. You talk about traffic safety, congestion, transit. A lot of those challenges are centered on those arterials, many of which are state-owned. So what do you think we can do to try to attack those arterials at scale and redesign them in a way that is people-centric and cut down on the crashes, improve transit service? It seems like they're just big barriers in all of our communities.
Well, I think one way would be to take jurisdiction of all those streets, but that is very expensive because that would mean you're hypothetically not eligible then for federal support or state support to make improvements or changes. I think the way the city's doing it makes sense. They're doing it piece by piece. So like Western Avenue in the Lincoln Square area, they've been working on that stretch of Western for a while. And they've been making it much calmer, I think, than it had been in the past through the various treatments and devices. I think Ashland, the city's done a lot with just the kind of simple installations of things like the left turn calming and measures like that. But I think doing a full-length corridor that has multiple jurisdictions in control is a lot tougher because of just the scale that would be required in terms of taking jurisdiction. Unless the state changes, who knows? Gia Biaggi is there, maybe it'll change.
For the sake of time, we will end our Q&A here, but I welcome you to track down Luann. I'm opening you up to that. She'll be here most of today, so come find her. Thank you again for this amazing opening, introducing us all.